Greetings, kids, and welcome to Let Me Tell You What I Know, a podcast by The Real Nubian on Twitter where I talk about music, politics, pop culture, and whatever the hell I want. Basically, giving you my 2 cents that nobody asked for. Welcome to episode 16. And for this episode, I will be talking about books I am currently reading. And I chose this random topic because I ran out of material again and asked you guys on a poll to choose for me which topic to talk about. And the consensus was to talk about the books I am currently reading and what I think about them and about what books I'm planning to read in the future. So what triggered this is that a couple of months ago, a viral tweet said that people who were bookworms as kids were trying to escape from a difficult childhood. So basically being a nerdy, bookish weirdo was a trauma response. And for starters, my apologies, this will get a bit heavy. But I did relate to this tweet very much because I had a rather difficult childhood. While I still acknowledge all the financial and material privileges I was awarded, I grew up with critical, judgmental, and emotionally abusive parents who believed in corporal punishment as the only mode of discipline, which was pretty common back in the 80s and the 90s, but it's still trash mentality, and there is nothing you can do or say to change my mind about that. In addition to suppressed CSA, and they all take a toll on a person. Disclaimer here, I have forgiven my parents because I decided to factor in their intentions. They literally didn't know any better, and currently, after a lot of conversations and healing, my mom regrets following these draconic parenting techniques. So anyway, some people, like me, become withdrawn and probably would like to completely detach from reality into imaginary worlds. And since I was a child of the 80s and the internet didn't exist back then, books were your only means of escape. So the tweet made a lot of sense to me. And I half-heartedly tried to look into psychology articles about the tweet and its subject matter, but I couldn't find much. But there are many reading blogs that talk about overcoming trauma with reading. So this is what I know about the issue so far. If you're listening to this and you can share with me and my listeners any academic references about this concept, find me on Twitter and I will be very grateful for you. Anyway, so I started reading pretty early, and my parents, as any Middle Eastern parents, supported that very much. A kid with their nose buried in books will probably stay out of trouble and achieve the academic success these tiger parents, and I use quote unquote here, these tiger parents really crave. So they started buying me books to read since I was 3. And the books just kept on coming. All the Lady Bird series of the old fables and fairy tales, and then simplified versions of the classics like Dickens, Shakespeare, Jane Austen, Agatha Christie was a favorite, Arthur Conan Doyle, Jules Verne, H.G. Wells, and by the 5th grade I even started dabbling in Russian literature. I have mentioned this story before where my mom went to Moscow in the early 90s, probably 90 or 91, and I was 10 at the time, to visit my uncle who was going to med school there. And she told him that my kid likes to read, she loves reading, so he sent me an Arabic translation of A Hero from Our Times by Mikhail Lermontov, which is pretty heavy reading. I don't know what he was thinking at the time, but he did. And I love that book. I still love that book, but of course, when you read something like that as a child, and then as a teenager, and then an adult, the perspective changes a lot. So anyway, I also read a lot of Arabic popular fiction, and I have to say, all my readings were in Arabic, by the way. While I started learning English at 3, I never really enjoyed reading in it until I got into university. And my classmates started introducing me to Jackie Collins and Sidney Sheldon and all the popular, I like to call them pop culture, not pop culture, what do you call it? That thing that made Andy Warhol famous. I can't think of it at the top of my head right now. But anyway, these popular writers who are very prolific and they write exciting stories that like teenagers and young adults used to like in the 90s. So Sidney Sheldon, Jackie Collins, historical romance, which I regret deeply because these books were pretty problematic. And I needed to teach myself to read in English because I transitioned from an Arabic-based education in middle school and high school to med school, where all my college textbooks were in English. And the beginning, it was the beginning of let's learn to think in English trip, which is funny. Being bilingual is actually very interesting. You grow up thinking in one language, and it's the language you communicate the best with and you dream with, and then somehow life forces your brain to shift to your second language and make it your primary. By the way, I might change the name of this podcast to Tangent, because why is it so hard to stay on topic? Must be the ADHD brain. And I will talk next time about how Twitter probably diagnosed my potential ADHD for me. And as you can tell, 99% of the books I read are fiction, and for non-fiction material, I prefer to cruise the internet. So anyway, back to the books. I have read a lot of fiction in my years, and if BookTube existed when I was a teenager, I would be a very successful YouTube sensation right now, swimming in money. But by the end of medical school and when I started my job training, I was like the Titanic that hit the iceberg. Completely lost my drive to read, and it was the longest reading slump in human history. About 12 freaking years. Where I read probably the total of 7 books in 12 years. And I read each once. But I was busy working and studying, okay? And despite hoarding so many physical books and having a reading app on all my electronic devices where I hoarded more ebooks, I couldn't read worth a damn. Watching YouTube videos and engaging with people on social media became easier and less demanding distraction from the stresses of life and work. Reading became hard work, which is strange for me. So a couple of years ago, I decided to spend more time reading and less time tweeting. Which is not happening, hasn't happened yet. But it is, of course, impossible to go from being someone who hardly reads anything to someone who reads 2 books a month, which was my personal Goodreads challenge for 2020. And by the way, I failed at that. But I'm happy with my results. I read 12 books last year. And this uptick in my reading happened thanks to my friends on Twitter, to be honest. At the end of 2019, Daphne and Ninja decided to start the Satan's 300 Bitches book club, which is a very peculiar name, but I promise there's a backstory and an inside joke to explain this. But it was what I needed to push me, and I can't thank them enough for giving me the push I needed to get my shit together. Then, well into the plague year, the year of our Lord 2020, 2 things happened. I became friends with one of the coolest people in my life, Wendy Weissman, who you guys have heard here before, and Jessica, aka Moxie, who became a mutual over feminist Twitter. So Wendy and I started reading Circe by Madeline Miller, who we gushed about here before, and Jess, at around a similar time, announced that she wanted to read the classic all libertarians and right-wingers love to inappropriately quote, 1984 by George Orwell. And she asked people if they wanted to read it with her. This led to the formation of our book club titled This Book is Problematic Book Club. And the 2 reading experiences, although they couldn't be more polar opposites to each other, were the catalyst for the improving reading experience that I had. Circe was a joy to read. The messaging, the modernization of popular Greek myths, the well thought out feminist perspective, the character development, like chef's kiss, 10 out of 10, highly recommend. I cannot ramble about it enough. Now we come to the freaking bane of my freaking existence, 1984. And I do understand the message Orwell was trying to convey, but I couldn't agree more with our socialist brother in arms over here. No one likes totalitarian governments. and the constant surveillance, and the government thwarting freedom of speech and turning citizens into obedient zombies. And trust me, I grew up in the Middle East when the legacy of Gamal, with the legacy of Gamal Abdel Nasser, and I lived in Saudi Arabia, and I was around when Saddam Hussein, Muammar Gaddafi, and Omar al-Bashir were presidents. I can legitimately tell you that they took 1984 and turned it from a cautionary tale to a user manual, basically. It's not funny, it's horrifying, but it's just mind-blowing how that happened. But the delivery, the characters, the lectures disguised as the characters reading a copy from the book written by the rebel, or the, like, if eventually we found out he's not real, but anyway, the rebel in the book against the government, Immanuel Goldstein. The book was called The Theory of Practice of Oligarchical Collectivism. And instead of putting the message into dialogue between the characters are reading the book, and it just inserts pages and pages from the book, and it becomes like a poli-sci lecture, basically. So, a funny tangent. I met an Italian guy on Facebook like years ago who was named Emmanuel after this character in the book. I thought it was the coolest shit ever before I read the book, and now I feel bad for the guy for having an edgelord for a father. Anyway, the name is nice. It's a common Italian name, probably, but that was his father's reasoning for choosing this particular name for his son, which is weird AF. Anyway, back to... Anyway, we're not here to talk about Orwell and his pain-in-the-ass masterpiece. But Jess and the book club that formed after her tweet, where I am with reading today, are like, I cannot thank her enough also for that. And the members of the book club, I love you guys. You know who you are, and we should get back to to reading again. Okay. And I was also heavily influenced by book bloggers on YouTube and Instagram. In my opinion, they have the best job on earth. My issue is that most of them are in their late teens, early 20s, and their tastes range between the classics I have already read, like a lot of them are big Jane Austen fans, which is a very, very common author among the booktubers. Or they dabble into the young adult fiction, which I'm mostly not interested in. Like, I'm not into the Divergent series or the Harry Potter world or whatever. I'm too old for this shit, okay? So, and the Hunger Games, no, thank you, no. I could watch the movies. The movies are entertaining, but I feel absolutely zero connection with the books, especially Divergent and Hunger Games. Harry Potter books, she who shall not be named, was an interest for some time, but not anymore. Anyway, I also enjoy the recommendations of black bloggers, and I think it's obvious why. I don't have to explain a lot. So I'm starting to enjoy reading for fun again, and it's not a chore or a race to complete a Goodreads challenge. I do read a couple of pages every day, and it's chill, relaxing, and therapeutic exercise for me. But it's hard to focus on one book like I used to. Before I would have one book, just read it from cover to cover, get it done, and then move on to the next book. Now it has become really hard for me to focus on one book, and sometimes it gets hard to read certain books, and you have to take a break, read something else, and go back to them later when you're in a better headspace. And this applies especially to books that were published anytime before the last third of the 20th century, and I'll explain this as we go along. So after I have rambled for all this time, let me start with the list of books I wanted to talk about. The first book is a book I was reading when I announced the topic of the episode a couple of weeks ago, and it's The Man in the High Castle by Philip K. Dick. And I came to know about PKD as the readers refer to him, which is funny because PKD automatically translates in my brain to polycystic kidney disease, the grim brain of a doctor. Okay, anyway, back to the guy. So I came to know of the novel back in 2015 when the Amazon Prime TV show based on the novel was released. And first of all, Rufus Sewell is a part of the cast, and I would watch anything with Rufus Sewell in it. Google how he looks like, and you would understand. So I bought the digital version of the novel in an attempt to utilize the technology I am privileged to own and get a glimpse of the story before I watched the TV show. I also came to know that PKD wrote a lot of the popular science fiction stories we have known as movies, like Blade Runner, Minority Report, the 2 versions of Total Recall, and The Adjustment Bureau. It was fascinating to me because I never paid attention to where these movies actually came from. He was born in the 20s, died in 1981, literally 6 months before I was born, and I have never heard of this guy before 2015. Wow. Anyway, and he published his works between the 1950s and 1970s, and this was quite an interesting period for speculative fiction, which is his genre of choice, particularly science and dystopian fiction. And it made sense considering the world events at the time. The world was recovering from the Second World War. There was the nuclear and space races happening between the USA and the USSR, the civil rights movement. So what could be a better atmosphere for a novel that imagines the world under the control of the Nazis? In this book, the Allies lost the war because they lost Churchill and Roosevelt, thus losing the 2 great minds that won the war in real life against Germany and Japan. Of course, I'm aware that the president who was governing the US during the end of the war was Eisenhower, but everything that led to the US victory was during Roosevelt's time. Anyway, and the 2 victors divided the planet among them. The Nazis afterwards set their sights on colonizing other planets. And Elon Musk, I'm looking at you and I don't like you, okay? So anyway, those who are my friends on Twitter would understand this reference. Anyway, the novel was published in 1962 and it's set in the same year, almost 15 to 20 years after the end of the war. It's located in the US and most of the events happened between California and Colorado. The western side of the USA is controlled by the Imperial Government of Japan, and the east coast is controlled by the Reich. The south is controlled by Americans, but pretty much it's a dig at the antebellum South because it says that they have given their loyalty to the Nazis in a heartbeat. It is also clear that Japan is weary and regretful of its pact with Germany. They don't approve of many of their plots and methods, including the Holocaust, mentioned a couple of times. And they deem this collaboration as a necessity for their survival. So this impacts how the Japanese officials in San Francisco, which is the main set of most of the events of the book, respond to dealing with their German peers. Anyway, so San Francisco is governed by the Japanese, and many of them live there as citizens, while Americans are treated as almost second-class citizens. Another important plot point is the best-selling novel everyone and their mother is reading in the book. It's called The Grasshopper Lies Heavy, and it gets get ready for this inception moment. The novel is about a world where the Allies won the war. So naturally it is banned in the Nazi-controlled parts of the world, but if you live in the Pacific side, which is controlled by Japan, it's permitted to be sold and read. It was written by a reclusive writer called Hawthorne Abenson, who lives in a mysterious part of Colorado, and his house was dubbed the High Castle because apparently he's hiding from the Nazis. So this is what brought up the title of the book. The book critiques the racial stereotypes each group had for each other, and one of the characters that stood out to me a lot was Robert Sheldon. He's an antique dealer in San Francisco. He's a white guy, and he caters to the rich and powerful Japanese residents and tourists in the city by selling them American pop culture trinkets. Like he had a request from one of the Japanese officials to prepare a gift for a visiting top important person. And that was really funny to me because they really value American culture trinkets and old turn of the century small items and tchotchkes, as they would call them, and Civil War weapons. So the amazing gift that he came up with was actually a Mickey Mouse watch, and every time I remember this I can't stop laughing. Anyway, He's a white guy who is very salty about how white people are not on the top of the food chain anymore. But of course, he hides his saltiness very well because he doesn't want to compromise his business. And he graces us with many internal monologues laden with racism. But he has to pepper in a dash of fetishization of one of the Japanese women that he had to conduct business with, and while proclaiming that he's a good guy. So I was telling a friend on Twitter that if a fictional character could explain Trump supporters who think that they're good people and kind people and they're not racist for supporting Trump, it would be Robert Sheldon. Anyway, don't even get me started about how minorities are treated and mentioned in the book. Black people, Chinese people, Italians, Jewish people, so many triggers. And since the book was published in the 60s, racial slurs are flying left and right. It was hard to go through sometimes. The two Jewish characters had to hide their identities and names to escape literal extermination by the Nazis. So there are no featured characters that are Black, Latino, or non-Japanese Asians in the novel either. They just melt into the background. And I did compare the book to 1984 a lot. They're both dystopian novels that describe the world as it falls under the control of unabashed fascists, basically. And but I much prefer this one. This one is a more well-rounded novel with better characters that you can connect with and empathize with, not hate their guts like Wilson and Julia, okay? But you can empathize with them, and sometimes you might actually like these characters. And there are no protracted historical recitations, and even when Philip K. Dick inserts parts of the book his characters are reading, they are not long or mind-numbing. So basically, it is not a political science lecture. Orwell focused more on how governments impact people, brainwash and torture them, while PKD shows how governments can control people with very impressive subtlety. So everyone is scared of the Nazis, obviously, because of what they have done to Jewish people and other atrocities mentioned in the book. But they live happy, quiet lives nonetheless, as long as they don't cause any trouble. And the conversations about thought crimes and obedience are very subversive. PKD also does a better job demonstrating the inner workings of individual humans, so much better than Orwell. So in summary, I like this book a lot. I gave it 4 out of 5 on Goodreads when I finished it. And actually, by the time I started scripting and recording this episode, it was already over. So it doesn't really fall under the category of books I'm currently reading, but I have just finished it, so whatever. Anyway, it gave me material. I also want to read more books by Philip K. Dick. And I'm keeping in mind the criticisms that he received. He received a bunch of criticisms about the way he wrote women from another science fiction writer. Her name is Ursula Le Guin, and apparently he was receptive to the criticism and improved the way he wrote his female characters. So anyway, this novel won a Hugo Awards, and here's a fun fact about the Hugo Awards, which are awarded for science fiction novels. My dumbass thought it was named after Victor Hugo, and I was thinking about another French author, Jules Verne, who's the actual science fiction author. So how did that connect in my head? Because Victor Hugo doesn't write science fiction. Anyway, it made sense in my head for like 3 minutes, and then I actually Googled the award history and realized, what the hell? It was named after Hugo Gernsback, the founder of the pioneering science fiction magazine Amazing Stories, and the Hugos were first given in 1953. This novel received its Hugo in 1963 and still goes on until today. I'm very excited about going more into old school science fiction. I like that a lot. Okay, so I'm also excited to watch the TV show finally. It's going into its 4th season, and my ass is late to the game as usual, but I can finally start watching the TV show that apparently expanded far beyond the plot of the book. So, the second book I'm still currently reading is Rage of Angels by Sidney Sheldon. And if you watched lawyer movies from the 80s and the 90s, you would know exactly how Sidney Sheldon books feel like. intense characters, fast-paced plots that almost always show you a very powerful leading female character. Usually gets wronged by one of the men around her, and she manages life by sheer wit, gut, and stunning looks. And they're not always like daughters of rich families. Some of them came from humble beginnings. So anyway, something horrible happens to her. She manages to rise from the ashes, and occasionally there's a very deliciously cold served revenge on the antagonist who wronged her. And Sidney Sheldon was a very prolific writer. I first read one of his novels in college, as I have mentioned, something about midnight, that has themes consistent with what he usually writes about. And I read it several times, found out that it was turned into a movie starring Jane Seymour, who I was obsessed with because she played Dr. Quinn, Medicine Woman, my heroine in high school. And I read a couple more novels for him over the years, but because of the repetitive themes and characters he usually writes, they become difficult to distinguish from each other. So it's really, you can't really look at a title of a Sidney Sheldon book and really remember the plot and the characters. It's not easy for me personally. Anyway, so the novel I'm currently reading is an entertaining and fast read, I have to say. And since the novel is from the olden days, it was set in 1970, keep in mind that if you read those novels, you will run into many problematic words, phrases, and themes. But oh well. It's about a novice lawyer who is used by the New York mob to destroy a case the New York district attorney was working really hard on, literally on her first day of the job, interning for the said district attorney. So you really hit the ground running with like, oh my god, what the hell happened? District attorney is of course fuming. He sets out to destroy her and disbar her or whatever, completely run her out of New York. So they recruit a high-profile and well-connected lawyer who immediately, when you read about him, you think about Robert Redford in the 70s movies, to do the job for them. However, he is a fair person and he saves her ass, becomes her love interest, and then you add to the mix the mob boss who almost destroyed her career to begin with, and just make it a roller coaster of a read. I found out that the book turned into a mini-series in 1983 and was pleasantly surprised to find that one of my teenage year crushes, Armand Asante, was cast as one of the lead characters. Armand Asante came to my attention in the 90s when he starred in Francis Ford Coppola's mini-series about the Odyssey. So he played Odysseus. And before reading seriously, I always had the idea in my head that Odysseus was a hero. But then the character gets deconstructed in the book from the perspective of women who have to deal with, and I realized he was an asshole. So I'm not an Odysseus stan anymore, but I still love Armand Asante, okay? So he's in the miniseries, and it's available on YouTube in probably 4 or 5 parts. And again, if you watched movies from the 80s and the 90s, you realize immediately the setting, the filming process, and the camera angles, the background music and scores. A classic, an absolute classic. So far I'm 70% through the book, and I can't wait to see how it's going to end, because interestingly, I cannot really predict from how the events are going. I cannot really predict how this is going to end, and I'm excited for that. Okay. The third book on this amazing list so far is Valhalla by Tom Holt. And Tom Holt is a British fantasy writer who was recommended to me last year by a couple of friends on Twitter when I mentioned that I was reading the first book of the Witcher series to prepare myself for the Netflix adaptation. So he usually pulls a lot of his ideas from well-known European myths. Like, he has a story based on the Flying Dutchman. He has a book called Ye Gods, which is based on Greek myth, something based on Faust, something based on the Holy Grail, another book based on St. George slaying the dragon, which is a very classic English myth, and so on. But he also has other books or novels that are based on mythology from other parts of the world, like Aladdin and the Genie from 1001 Nights, which is an Arabic classic, and another one based on Chinese dragons. So the book I started reading, as I said, is Valhalla, which is published in the year 2000. And if you have any inclination towards Scandinavian/Norse mythology, you know that this is where the heroes reside after they pass. They have died honorably in battle, and now they get to eat, drink, and be merry while the Valkyries serve them wine, which is what we all expected. But in the book, for some reason, Attila the Hun is stuck in some sort of purgatory with other historical figures, and they are literally forced to watch paint dry for millennia. And I started reading and I got confused. So this is interesting. It's a book where you start the first chapter and the only emotion that you get is, what the hell is going on here? I need to know more. What is happening? How did this come to his mind? Okay? The other part of the plot is we realize quickly that someone had the bright idea to create an LLC out of the afterlife, where you can actually pay for your after-death experience according to how much dollar you can pay. The Rock Nation brunch Twitter should be quaking right now. Anyway, naturally, this new afterlife, which became a corporation, needs management and manpower. And this is where the story takes a weird and kind of a dark turn. So I'm still in the early chapters of the book, and I cannot stop saying, how the hell did he think of this? This is a wild ride from the beginning. Anyway, Tom Holt also has another series of fantasy books, and it's written under the pen name KJ Parker. He also has poetry books. I have Odds and Gods in my library, and I plan to read it immediately after I finish this one. Okay, the fourth book is by Tom Hanks. Yes, you heard me. The good old Hollywood dad, Tom Hanks. In 2017, he published an anthology of short stories in a book titled Uncommon Type. And it came to my attention because the lifestyle YouTuber who posts under the name The Milk and Honey Life mentioned the book and said she wanted to start like a book club, reading it, etc. The book club and discussion I was never able to catch up with, but I got the book on my Kobo app as well. So I started reading it in 2018 and I haven't finished it yet. First of all, I still don't understand the connection between the name and the stories. Apparently in reviews it is said that he wrote those stories inspired by his collection of typewriters. But he has a collection of vintage typewriters that he's very proud of, but I frankly don't understand the connection between a story about a recent divorcee with her 3 kids who move into a new neighborhood, and she's supposedly going to fall in love with her very age-appropriate next-door neighbor, and typewriters. The stories are not adding up in my mind. However, the stories are nice, so this is a very nitpicky moment for me. The stories are nice, very American working class people themed, nothing extraordinary or fantastical, but they are engaging and frankly soothing. There's a story about a group of friends that keeps circulating between the chapters, so you get like a couple of stories about random people, and then you get a chapter about this group of friends particularly. And the main protagonist among this group of friends seems very reminiscent of Tom Hanks. Other characters seem very reminiscent of him as well. Like if you take the story and change it into a movie, he would probably be very well suited to play the lead character. So it's a comfortable read. I have been chipping through it, as I said, since 2018. So every couple of months I go back and read a chapter. I honestly feel that his movie Larry Crown with Julia Roberts from 2015 is his closest movie to the type of stories that are said in the book. So I like it. It's on the roster. It's been going on for years. And hopefully I'll finish it this year. I hope so. Anyway, the last book I'm currently reading is the book on this book is Problematic Book Club. And though it's not very problematic, we chose it because we finished 1984 and it was exhausting. And then we started a book about Native American history written by a highly acclaimed American historian. And we got tired really quickly of his constant referral to Native Americans as savages. It's annoying. And we decided to take a breather. So we settled on a very popular novel among the youngsters on BookTube. It's titled Jonathan Strange and Mr. Narl by Suzanna Clarke. The novel is hella long. It's about 1,000 pages, and so many characters and a fascinating progression of events. It's about England during the Napoleonic Wars, so the early 19th century. It's 1907. The British society was composed of high society gentry who lived going through their inheritance, basically. I don't think these people even had jobs. But they had time to pontificate about random stuff and attend parties and in the London season and gossip about each other. It depends England with all its classic elements that you find in Jane Austen. Like certain parts are depicted in the country life. And what you see in Charles Dickens of the London life. And then there's a touch of the Arthur Conan Doyle mystery that you feel in the Sherlock Holmes stories. But it is set up in a parallel England where the use of magic is normal and acceptable. This is like the trick in the book. However, the book starts with magicians who haven't practiced magic in centuries, but the gentlemen who decided to devote themselves to magic just only have time for theoretical study and history of magic. Until one day they realize that there is one reclusive gentleman in York who actually practices magic. So he's like England's only magician and the real deal. And he doesn't do the sleight of hand trickery of street and carnival performance. He's actually a magician who communicates with the other side and can have like miraculous events plotted and planned and done. So the man, Mr. Narl, one of the titular characters, becomes an overnight sensation and is scooped up from his quiet, secluded mansion in York to the high society of London, where he is surrounded by new friends, and he offers his services to His Majesty's government to help them win the war against the French. Interesting, right? Suzanna Clarke spent years writing this book, and it was published in 2004. So we noted that it accurately... in the book club, we noted that it accurately describes English people, their traits, their relationships with each other, the different classes, their opinions of government. It was pretty hilarious to me. And in the book's Wikipedia page, I found a similar description. Clarke describes Englishness in all its layers and northern and southern English cultural tropes and stereotypes. It is written in a very classical manner. You would think that it was written by someone who actually lived in 1807, not a lady in the 20th century. So she uses old English vocabulary, and sometimes she even uses old spelling. And she uses footnotes extensively, which reminds me of my old medical school books, because I went through a British system and our textbook had a lot of footnotes for some kind of weird reason. Especially the surgical books, because a lot of diseases described had very fascinating histories behind it. So the authors couldn't help themselves and they had to add history in the form of footnotes. So this reminds me a lot of my old school books. Anyway, so she uses footnotes extensively, and especially in the early chapters, which makes reading the book more fun if you get the physical book. Because when you read the physical book, the footnotes are actually right in the page. While if you read it in digital form, which I have to do right now because I lost my physical copy, I don't know where it is, you have to click on the hyperlink of the footnote, read it, and then go find your page again, which can get a bit annoying, but it's fine. And so far we are in the early chapters, and the second main titular character, which is Jonathan Strange, hasn't appeared yet, and I'm excited to see what's going to happen when he does. Noteworthy here is that the novel was transformed into a BBC production and was released in 2015. A lot of people say that the TV show is slightly different from the book, so one cannot cheat their way through it by watching the TV show like I initially intended, and now I have to actually read the book. But the good thing is that I'm enjoying it. So this comes to the end of the list I'm currently reading. I hope I can pick up the pace and catch up with my Goodreads challenge for this year. And I set the target for 24 books, and I hope I can do better than last year. I have so many books in my library, but after this group is concluded, I plan to read one book by Octavia Butler, one book by N.K. Jemisin, and finish the Nellie Hopkinson book I started, so I can pick up that project of mine where I decided to talk about science fiction written by Black authors that's currently on the back burner. Eventually, we come to one of the best bits of this episode. My friend A.M. Young on Twitter came to the rescue and asked me a couple of questions that I would love to answer, and we can add more material to the episode. So here we go with her questions. First question. Any tips on how to actively overcome a reading slump? I personally don't have a good answer for this. So I checked BookTube and they have a lot of videos about that. And it seems to be a common advice to just start with small books, short stories, novellas, anything small, not exhausting, and just go through it. So choose books wisely that would not bore you or trigger you or whatever, and don't choose a book like Jonathan Strange and Mr. Narl, which is like 1,000 pages. Okay, so this is my tip on actively overcoming a reading slump. The second tip is to not be hard on yourself, which comes to her second question. How do you make peace with reading slumps? Reading is not a chore. I had to reconcile with that point and stop feeling guilty that I'm not reading and I'm spending my hours, my free time tweeting or watching YouTube or watching Netflix. Reading is not a job, it's not a chore, and we read to have fun and ease our minds, learn something new, essentially just as entertainment, basically. This, of course, if we're talking about reading for fiction and you don't have like assignments or whatever. Anyway, so you make peace with reading slumps by telling yourself that this is not your job and you don't get paid to do this. If you have other means to have fun or decompress or de-stress, then it's totally fine. We're not all meant to be bookworms. That's okay. So anyway, next question. How helpful was your bookworm phase as a trauma response? We made it official. Being a bookworm as a trauma response is a real thing. And it was really helpful because, as I said, it distracts you from the trouble that you're going through. It shows you other worlds and other characters that you can look up to as role models if the people in your life are not making good enough role models while you're growing up. And it just takes you away from whatever is hurting you. The other good bit is that it makes people sometimes leave you alone. So yeah, that was helpful for me. How do we encourage non-trauma response bookwormery? I think it just happens by showing people how fun reading is, showing them new books, especially for kids. If you teach kids from a young age that books are fun, they're going to grow up with that concept and just enjoy reading. So a lot of parents start reading for their kids from an early age, even when they're like infants and very young toddlers. And when they associate reading with enjoyment and happiness and coziness and safety with the parents, they will probably grow up with this frame of mind. For someone who didn't grow up reading extensively or a bookworm or enjoyed it, it's just a personal effort. I think you just show them how books can be fun and you recommend your best and you explain why this book was mind-blowing or life-altering for you, and you just hope that they respond well to how excited you are and how positive you feel about this experience. So what exactly drew you to the books you're currently reading? Peer pressure. Simple peer pressure and influenced by booktubers, media, etc. The Man in the High Castle, I decided to read the book because I saw the trailer of the TV show and I enjoyed it and the idea is interesting to me, and I thought the Man in the High Castle would be Adolf Hitler or something and they will try to overcome him. And I was wrong. And Sidney Sheldon is an easy read for me because this is what I got used to reading when I was in college, also because I was influenced by the choices of my classmates. Tom Holt, recommendation from friends, and I do like fantasy novels a lot. So I enjoyed Good Omens by Neil Gaiman. I enjoyed Circe. I enjoyed a lot of Arabic popular fiction that is based on fantasy. So I love Gothic fantasy, Frankenstein, Dracula, etc. A big fan of fantasy writing. So if you recommend a fantasy writer for me, I'm going to read it. Point blank, period. And the last book, which is Jonathan Strange and Mr. Narl, also falls under the category of fantasy fiction, but in the same vein, I grew up reading Jane Austen and Charles Dickens. So if you give me something that gives me a similar vibe, I'm going to gravitate towards it. Absolutely cool. And it came highly recommended from a lot of booktubers who are prolific readers, and I respect their opinions. Okay. How do you read them? In one go or in several sittings? It's been extremely impossible to read a book in one go. Like when I was younger and I had all my time to myself, I could do that, especially during the summer holidays. Like, what else have you got to do? You sit and you read your book. But now I have a job, and I have a kid, and I have a husband, and I have a Twitter career. So it's almost impossible to read a book in one sitting. Several sittings. I have my Kobo reader, and I have my books at home, my physical books, and I have quite a decent library on my e-reader, so I can read whenever I have a chance. And we just chip through these books as we go. Do you regret touching any of the books you are currently reading? The books I'm currently reading, I don't regret touching any of them. I actually quite enjoy all of them at the moment. I have books in my library that I'm apprehensive about, but we'll see how that goes. Do you stop reading certain books if you just can't? And yes, I have actually. I stopped reading 1984 several times. I stopped reading The Man in the High Castle because it was annoying initially, and then I went back to it again. So yeah, it happens that you start reading a book and it just gets too irritating. And there's sometimes no redeeming quality in the book that makes you just go back to it. Some people would understand this in relationship to movies. Sometimes you go to a movie, you pay the ticket. I miss those days. You pay the ticket, you sit in that theater, and then you start losing your mind. Why am I here? This is horrible. And the only thing making you stay is that you paid those dollars for this ticket. You just power through sometimes, but some books are just intolerable, and you don't torture yourself. It's not worth it. So anyway, lastly, BookTube when never. Never. It's such a production to sit and have a camera set up and a microphone set up, and you guys have no idea how technologically challenged I am. Like right now, I'm using my plug-in microphone through my phone, which is great because it keeps the sound quality consistent, but it doesn't work when I record with other people, and I don't know how to overcome that. And this shows you how much of a mess I am when it comes to technology and recording and producing a podcast. So we're flying in by the seat of our pants. So there is no way in hell, unless I suddenly become uber rich and I can hire a team of like a videographer, an editor, and just pay them to do these things for me while I just sit, look good, and ramble. Okay, so in the time being, I don't think I'll be able to get invested in a YouTube channel dedicated for books and reading. So sorry. Anyway, so this brings me to the end of the episode, and I hope it was entertaining and interesting enough for you guys to follow the podcast and listen for more episodes, and go back and listen to the previous episodes. We have a bunch of random stuff that happened here. Also, catch me outside. How about that? I'm just kidding. I'm sorry. That was horrible. Catch me on Twitter. I'm at TheRealNubian2. One word, just one go. And take care of yourselves. Take care of others. And since the pandemic is not over, keep wearing that mask. Practice social distancing. Avoid gatherings. And get vaccinated if you can. I love you guys. And I'll talk to you next time.